30th, 2021, Major General Chris Donahue boarded a C-17 Globemaster aircraft and issued his final command to American troops in Afghanistan: flush the force. Within 10 minutes, Donahue's plane and the 4 others on the ground at Hamid Karzai International Airport took to the skies, presumed to have been carrying somewhere between 500 and 600 American troops. As they lifted off the ground and travelled out of Afghan airspace, they marked the conclusion not only to almost 20 years of continual occupation of the country by American forces, but to the weeks-long dumpster fire of an evacuation that had heralded their leaving. Now, we've already done a video over on our sister channel Warographics exploring the disaster that was the American withdrawal process, but today we're going to look at what exactly came after. With Afghanistan effectively ceded by the Western world, it took almost no time at all for the entire nation to be brought squarely under the control of the Taliban, and since then, Afghanistan and its people have been embroiled in economic and humanitarian crises. The Taliban appears to understand acutely that the United States has washed its hands of the whole Afghanistan affair, and with few outlets for relief left among the Afghan people, the situation there may only get worse. So in order to understand what came afterwards, it's important to understand both the speed of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the disorganization and chaos that came with it. Originally slated for the 11th of September 2021, the American timeline was moved up less than 2 months from their new evacuation date and withdrew suddenly from their long-held locations across the country, not least Bagram Air Base, which the US abandoned in the dead of night without informing Afghan security forces, leaving behind massive amounts of military hardware. Sensing the instability of their situation, the Afghan security forces essentially collapsed, and Afghanistan's major cities fell to the Taliban basically unopposed. The US-backed Afghan president Ashraf Ghani fled the country, and the United States was forced to conduct haphazard evacuation flights on an airfield that was at times swarmed with Afghans so desperate to flee the Taliban that many were documented falling from the exterior of US aircraft, where they'd attempted to cling on for dear life with little hope for their own survival. The civil and military leaders of the United States and of much of the world were shocked by the speed of Afghanistan's collapse, and in an effort to simply escape with as many lives intact as possible, the United States made no effort to oppose the Taliban from assuming full control of the country. So, then, big question is, who are the Taliban? With a name that translates literally to students in the Pashto language, the Taliban are an organization of Sunni Islamist hardliners originating in northern Pakistan during the 1990s. The Taliban have fought for control of Afghanistan for decades and had ruled the country from 1996 to 2001 before maintaining an insurgency mostly in Afghanistan's rural areas for the next 20 years. Although the actual American withdrawal from Afghanistan took place under the watch of President Joe Biden, it was his predecessor, Donald Trump, who negotiated a peace deal with the Taliban in 2020, an agreement in which the Taliban made commitments to a series of peace talks with the internationally recognized Afghan government, but which did not include any way to enforce compliance. As should probably have been predicted, the Taliban declined to negotiate in any good faith with the Ghani administration, and when it came time for the US to depart as promised, the Taliban maintained a healthy perimeter around the Americans while swallowing up the territory that they'd coveted for so long. Now, as part of the peace process, the Taliban had made commitments to more modern, westernized principles of governance, that all girls should be allowed to be educated, that Afghanistan should be kept safe and free, and that the rights of all Afghans, including those who did not agree with the Taliban's goals, should be protected. In this realm too, the promises the Taliban made had no mechanism of enforcement, and although we'll go through each one in depth today, suffice to say for now that each promise has been broken or just ignored entirely. Instead, they've made good on the goals that they've held for decades, to institute a version of peace that favors their political and cultural interests and to implement their preferred version of Islamic law. Now, at this time, the Taliban controls not only the Afghan capital city of Kabul, but the entirety of Afghanistan, opposed only by relatively small rival groups like the Islamic State in Khorasan and the National Resistance Front. Of the groups trying to stand up to the Taliban, none have both the desire to restore a republic and the political or military ability to organize a meaningful resistance. The Taliban follow their so-called supreme leader, a cleric and Islamic scholar named Hibatullah Akhundzada, who prefers to rule from the shadows. Akhundzada is about 60 years old and is seen by many experts as the person responsible for uniting the Taliban well enough that an Afghan takeover was even possible. His son, for what it's worth, was one of the Taliban's own suicide bombers. The Taliban are notoriously secretive about the goings-on among their leadership, and much of Akhundzada's inner circle are only known by a few basic identifiers, but a few, including acting Prime Minister Hassan Akhund and First Deputy Leader Sirajuddin Haqqani, have made more of an impact than others. Now, speaking more broadly, the Taliban have assumed a sort of command within Afghanistan that is both expansive on the national level and often very vague in its actual commands and expectations. With no governing constitution and an administration still filled with interim appointees, Akhundzada's government is made up entirely of men who were high-ranking Taliban prior to the takeover. Around the country, Taliban appointees oversee civil servants, most of whom have returned to work after an initial period of panic and fear around the takeover. Taliban officials implement a highly individualistic interpretation of their rule of law, with local bands of security forces at liberty to decide which acts are considered criminal and which civilians should be detained. For those unlucky enough to face the ire of the Taliban's legal system, judges in Afghanistan are now encouraged to fully impose their own interpretation of Sharia law, including amputation of limbs, flogging, and public execution. Over 100 such shows of force took place in stadiums across Afghanistan in the space of a month in late 2022. Despite their legal changes and a robust system of taxation and revenue collection, the government has not taken the necessary steps to set up a comparable level of governance in any other sector, and especially in rural areas, there is little to none of the sort of oversight that might prevent individual Taliban leaders from ruling as warlords. The effectiveness and brutality of that rule are both widely variant, as the Taliban's former fighters adapt to roles that require little, if any, fighting at all. So, as we go through the effects of Taliban rule at home, it's only right that we begin with the issue that earns the greatest dread from international observers before and during the American withdrawal: women's rights. The Taliban have had a long history of blocking women's access to education, employment, public resources, and other basic freedoms. And although the Taliban made some early promises to protect the right of girls to get a basic education, these appear to have been little more than lip service. Within the first year of Taliban rule, women were expected to begin covering their faces and using traditional garments, and although girls were still allowed to attend both primary school and university, they were banned from attending secondary school. Effectively, this would have allowed the Taliban to phase out university education for girls much more quickly without the sort of international outcry that an outright ban might have brought on. But the spectre of controversy appears not to have mattered that much at all. In December 2022, women were banned from attending university completely. Women were also banned from working for NGOs and aid operations, an act that both removed one of the few remaining avenues for women to support themselves and also hamstrung the ability of NGOs to operate in Afghanistan at all. Elsewhere in the workplace, women are barred from employment within the government and most sectors of industry, and in one particularly revealing move, the country's finance ministry asked its women employees to recommend a male relative for their roles explicitly so that they could be sacked. As it stands now, women are not permitted to travel more than 70 kilometers without being accompanied by a close male relative, and pharmacies have been gutted of contraceptive medicine while the quality of healthcare for expectant mothers and their newborns has continuously declined. The Taliban are believed to be considering even more repressive measures against women and girls in the coming years, especially since the organizations that women have relied upon for support are beginning to close up shop by necessity. Primary education, in particular, is believed to be on the chopping block for an absolute ban. And it's not just women who've caught the brunt of the Taliban's discriminatory social policies. Members of Afghanistan's ethnic minorities have been cleared out of most government postings and only minimally involved with the Taliban's decision-making. They are also prime targets for the Taliban's police forces and are subject to harassment and arbitrary detainment, often scapegoated as alleged members of local low-grade insurgencies in their regions. Afghanistan's LGBT population has faced targeted attacks, sexual assault, and risk of death, while internally displaced people within the country have been shot dead, held inside Afghanistan's borders, or denied the ability to apply for asylum. Cultural expression has been sharply limited too. These days, it's illegal to play or listen to music in Afghanistan, and popular media has been subject to careful restriction and censorship to ensure that the Afghan cultural life they portray closely lines up with what the Taliban expects for its people. Then there's the economy. Prior to the US withdrawing from their country, 47% of Afghans already lived in poverty, but 1 year later, that number had jumped to 97%. So high, in fact, that many Afghan families have been forced to resort to organ donation or the sale of their children for marriage simply in order to feed themselves. An international freeze on Afghan foreign reserves has left the Taliban utterly unequipped to respond, although it bears noting that the reason for the freeze, as well as the withdrawal of many major organizations, was due to concerns that the Taliban might simply put that money into their own pockets. Although global relief has helped to keep most Afghans from starving outright, the population has otherwise gone without any meaningful sort of help, and doctors, lawyers, policymakers, engineers, and other highly educated members of Afghan society have left the country en masse. At this point, the economy is in shambles, and it's projected to only shrink further in the coming years. And just because Afghans aren't necessarily starving, there is a lot of room between starvation and food security, with the vast majority of the population far closer to having nothing than they are to having enough. In 2022, 86% of Afghans reported that they could not afford food, and over half the population, some 20 million people, are at crisis or emergency levels of food insecurity, according to the World Food Programme. This is the worst level of food insecurity that the world has seen in over a decade, and in the face of depleted food stocks, Afghanistan's already low rations are expected to be cut in half for over 4 million people for months prior to the 2023 harvest season. Now, at the time of writing, the harvest hasn't happened yet, but even if it happens to be particularly bountiful, it would still only be a temporary stopgap measure before next year's lean months. If the harvest is poor, the situation is likely to get even worse and fast. Given Afghanistan's persistent droughts in recent history, it's difficult to be optimistic about this. And then there's public health, which would be a catastrophe of its own even before the complicating layers of malnutrition and barriers to access. Several aid groups like Doctors Without Borders are continuing to do their very best to maintain emergency care services and treat the sickest patients, but with limited resources, their numbers haven't been enough to keep up with the outbreaks of pneumonia, tuberculosis, measles, and malaria, all of which have taken turns ravaging the bodies of Afghans who are already low on food. Afghanistan is one of only a few nations to still have the polio virus in circulation, and while it's nowhere near outbreak status, cases have picked up in the last year and a half. The country is also in a pharmaceutical crisis, with key medications no longer available, and many facilities lack the funding to even pay the limited number of Afghan doctors and nurses who still remain. And of course, no discussion of any authoritarian regime's sphere of control would be complete without touching on their attitude toward the free press. In the Taliban's case, well, they're not exactly fans of it. The leaders of the Taliban have been accused of violence against members of the media in Afghanistan, with deliberate media repression being more likely if a journalist is working outside Kabul or if they are a woman. En masse, media workers in Afghanistan have reported threats and explicit directions from the Taliban on what to write or what not to write about, with large proportions of that intimidation being directed toward potential stories about the Taliban's own violence. As a result, many journalists within Afghanistan have been forced to self-censor their material, and those who haven't risk being harassed or even attacked. These attacks in particular are highly likely to go unreported when they happen. After all, who's going to write about them other than the reporter being attacked? Many media outlets have simply been shut down, and most of the remaining ones have been subsumed to the Taliban's will. As for popular protest, this gets shut down just as quickly. Peaceful protesters have been arbitrarily detained, tortured, and disappeared en masse. Now finally, it's worth circling back in to focus on one group in particular: the many Afghan soldiers, interpreters, community leaders, and other dedicated personnel who assisted the United States and coalition forces during nearly 20 years of occupation. Before and during the Afghanistan withdrawal, onlookers around the world expressed extreme concern for the conditions that these people might face if the Taliban took over, and many American veterans and aid workers who had worked alongside Afghan friends did their very best to ensure that those friends were on one of the flights that left Kabul. Luckily, many did manage to escape, but more were left behind, and their individual ordeals after the fact have been anything from difficult to downright tragic. In the months following the Taliban takeover, hundreds of former soldiers of the Afghan security forces were killed or disappeared, especially in rural areas, despite the Taliban's public assurances that they would be given amnesty. Judges, interpreters, peace activists, and many others had found themselves in the Taliban's crosshairs prior to their full takeover, as if to ensure that those people wouldn't be a problem later. And by the accounts of people still living there, the Western coalition's former Afghan collaborators have suffered exactly the fate that many feared. Others, including former interpreters, have been blacklisted by the Taliban government and barred from receiving the visas promised to Afghans who helped the US. And there are quite a few former US allies who just haven't been heard from since the invasion, with their friends in the US and Europe forced to recognize that nobody is both willing and able to track them down in Afghanistan, even just to see if they're still alive.